If you want a brutally honest test of modern life, don't imagine a blackout with candles and cozy blankets. Imagine the moment you go to the bathroom and nothing works. No floss, no water pressure. No, just deal with it later. Because the real crisis isn't discomfort, it's what happens when hygiene stops being automatic and becomes a decision you have to make over and over under stress. During the Cold War, families were taught to treat sanitation as survival, and they had a real plan for what to do when plumbing failed. Not a meme, not a gimmick, an actual system designed to prevent a small problem turning into illness. In this video, I'm going to show you why they took emergency toilets seriously, what most people today get completely wrong when they prep, and how to build a simple, safe setup at home that works even if the disruption lasts longer than you expect. And the most important part isn't the bucket. It's the one rule that decides whether your home stays clean or slowly becomes a hazard. In the Cold War, people didn't prepare for emergencies the way we do now, by buying gadgets that look reassuring. They prepared for systems failing in boring, unglamorous ways, the kind of failures that don't make headlines until they've already made you miserable. And that's why emergency toilets were treated as a real, adult subject rather than a joke, because sanitation is what separates inconvenience from a health problem. In Britain, the Civil Defense Campaign, known as Protect and Survive, was produced across the 1970s and then published to the public in 1980. And for all the controversy around its nuclear war framing, it reveals something very honest about how governments and households thought under pressure. You don't just need food and torches, you need a plan for what happens when a toilet becomes unusable. The pamphlet itself explicitly lists basic toilet articles alongside a bucket and plastic bags and points readers to a sanitation section, not as an afterthought, but as part of what you'd set up in a protected room if normal services stopped. And the accompanying film materials go even further, describing an emergency toilet as a bucket lined with a bin liner, suggesting you rig a seat, reminding you to have disinfectant and toilet rolls, and even recommending 2 separate bins outside the main room. One for toilet waste, one for food waste, with a simple instruction to seal bags tightly before binning. That is not the language of comfort. It's the language of keeping a household clean when the normal infrastructure isn't there to carry your waste away for you. It also tells you something about the Cold War household mindset. They assumed you might be stuck at home for a period of time, possibly with limited water, limited power, and limited outside help, and that the fastest way for a family to fall apart psychologically wasn't necessarily hunger. It was filth, smell, and the constant stress of, what do we do now? Every single time somebody needs the loo. When you're nervous, you make mistakes. When your living space feels contaminated, you stop thinking clearly. When you lose dignity, morale collapses. So the emergency toilet wasn't really about the bucket. It was about removing a daily crisis and turning it into a routine you can manage. That same logic shows up in modern preparedness guidance around the world, even when the context is completely different: earthquakes, floods, storms. Because the physics of sanitation doesn't change with the decade. You'll find contemporary emergency supplies checklists from local authorities that still recommend a large plastic bucket, rubbish bags, toilet paper, and disinfectant specifically for an emergency toilet, which is basically the same concept with modern wording and less Cold War atmosphere. And the reason those lists keep reappearing is simple. Plumbing isn't a single object in your bathroom, it's a chain. It relies on water pressure, pumps, treatment plants, and a working network of pipes, and when any part of that chain is disrupted, whether by blackout, a burst main, freezing temperatures, a local contamination event, or simply infrastructure strain, your toilet can quickly become something you shouldn't use. Cold War families were trained to think in chains because the era was obsessed with cascades, one failure triggering another. So they made their plans modular. You can almost hear the practical voice behind it. Assume your taps may slow or stop. Assume the flush may not work. Assume you may need to stay put. Prepare the basic items now, while you're calm, so you don't improvise later when you're not. And improvisation is where people get hurt, not because they're foolish, but because the mind under stress chooses the shortest path, and the shortest path in sanitation is often the dirtiest path. The Cold War approach tried to prevent that by giving households a simple system that turns a revolting problem into a sequence: contain, seal, separate, disinfect, and keep living space clean. That's what made it real. Not a novelty, not a camping trick, but a domestic procedure. And once you see it that way, you start to notice how strange modern assumptions are. We treat plumbing as a permanent background feature, like gravity, so we don't plan for its absence until it's already absent, and by then the options get worse by the hour. In other words, the emergency toilet wasn't an odd Cold War relic. It was a quiet admission that civilization is partly a set of pipes, and that pipes fail. But here's the part most people miss. You don't need a nuclear scare for this to matter, because modern plumbing can become a crisis for reasons that are far smaller, far more ordinary, and far more likely than anyone wants to admit. And once you see how quickly the chain can break, you'll understand why the right emergency toilet plan is less about hardware and more about one rule that prevents a minor disruption turning into a genuine health hazard. What makes modern plumbing feel guaranteed is the fact you don't see the machinery behind it, and that invisibility has trained us into a dangerous assumption. But the toilet is a fixed feature of civilization, not a service delivered by a fragile chain. But the Cold War mindset was the opposite. They looked at daily life and asked which comforts are actually systems, because systems can fail in a cascade. And plumbing is one of the biggest cascades in your home. It depends on energy, pumping, pressure, chemical treatment, distribution networks, and wastewater conveyance, all working in sync. When that chain breaks, the failure isn't dramatic at first. It's just a tap that slows, a flush that feels weak, a strange notice from the water company, a local power cut, and then suddenly the most normal room in your house becomes the most stressful one. In the United States, the scale alone should kill the idea that this is rare. Multiple infrastructure summaries cite roughly 240,000 water main breaks a year, which is the kind of number you only get when a system is aging under constant stress. The American Society of Civil Engineers materials around the report card also repeat that same estimate and describe pipes that in many places are decades old, even over a century old, which means the normal experience of water in your kitchen depends on buried assets you never see and can't quickly repair yourself. And it isn't just a question of inconvenience. The 2021 ASC category page for drinking water talks about a water main break every 2 minutes and around 6 billion gallons of treated water lost each day from leaks, which is an extraordinary figure to digest if you've ever believed the system is neatly under control. Now, add weather extremes and power disruption, and you get the kind of domino effect that feels unreal until it happens to you. The 2021 winter storm in Texas is a brutal example because it shows how quickly water becomes a public crisis once electricity and treatment are compromised. Reporting at the time described peaks of massive disruption, with millions affected and huge numbers of boil water notices issued. One Texas Tribune report described a peak where about 14.9 million Texans faced water disruptions, with more than 1,000 boil water notices after the storm. A peer-reviewed analysis later noted that in Texas alone, over 17 million people served by public drinking water systems were placed under boil water advisories for periods ranging from a day to more than a month, which tells you this wasn't a brief wobble, it was prolonged uncertainty. Reuters, covering the same event, described how treatment facilities lost power and more than 12 million residents across over 100 counties were advised to boil water, while the grid crisis unfolded. You don't need to be a survivalist to read those numbers correctly. If water pressure drops, if treatment is interrupted, if pipes freeze and burst, the bathroom stops being a private convenience and becomes a logistics problem. And that's the crucial psychological shift the Cold War era tried to force early. Treat sanitation as a plainable scenario, not a taboo topic. What makes the modern moment feel like a crisis is that we've built our homes around constant flow. Constant water, constant disposal, constant invisibility, and then we act shocked when a chain designed for normality struggles under abnormal conditions. You see a similar system strain conversation in the UK too, though the shape of the numbers is different. Ofwat's own public leakage page states that in 2024 to 25, England and Wales leaked 46. For liters of water per person per day, with Scotland and Northern Ireland around 80 liters per person per day, which is a simple way to explain hidden loss. Even when your tap works, a lot of the treated supply is bleeding away before it reaches anyone. And the UK government's 2024-25 Water Resources Performance Analysis discusses outage, temporary loss of production capacity due to unplanned events like equipment failure, power outages, system breakdowns, pollution. Reporting a national average daily outage figure in England in 2024-25. That matters because outages and leakage aren't abstract policy arguments when you translate them into lived experience. They're the backdrop for low pressure, intermittent supply, emergency tankers, restrictions, and the quiet reality that the infrastructure needs constant maintenance to keep normal feeling normal. The point of this section is not to scare you with statistics, but to remove the fantasy that plumbing is a personal appliance. It's not. It's a public machine. And public machines fail in patterns. Age, weather, power, demand spikes, contamination events, and knock-on effects. Once you accept that, you see why Cold War families were taught to think about the toilet in the same practical tone as torches and food. Because when sanitation goes wrong, the first consequences are humiliation and discomfort, but the second consequences can be sickness, especially if people start improvising in ways that contaminate living space. And here's the twist. Most modern prep advice still gets this wrong because it focuses on the object, the bucket, instead of the procedure. The Cold War plan wasn't a gimmick. It was a small, repeatable system designed to keep waste contained, separated, and managed without turning the home into a hazard. And once you see what that system actually was, you'll understand why one single rule matters more than every other purchase combined. The reason Cold War families had real emergency toilets is that they treated sanitation like a procedure, not a product, and that distinction is everything. A modern household hears emergency toilet and imagines a bucket in a cupboard, as if owning the object magically solved the problem. But Cold War civil defense guidance was fundamentally behavioral. It tried to stop people improvising in ways that contaminate their living space, because contamination is the invisible line where a short disruption becomes a genuine health risk. If you strip away the era's rhetoric and focus on the logic, the system is almost embarrassingly simple. Contain the waste, seal it properly, keep it away from where you live and eat, clean hands and surfaces consistently, and reduce the number of decisions you have to make each time you use it. That is why the bucket line with a bag concept keeps reappearing across decades. It's not a gimmick. It's the fastest way to create containment without plumbing. But the part people miss is that containment without routine still fails. Under stress, you will rush, and rushing is how you end up with leaks, spills, smells that spread, and hands that touch too many things. So a real emergency toilet plan starts with a designated setup, not a vague idea. You choose a specific location that balances privacy, stability, and hygiene, ideally somewhere that can be ventilated and that isn't right next to food preparation. You don't want in the middle of a living room where everyone is eating and sleeping, because psychologically that collapses dignity, and practically it increases the chance of cross-contamination. Then you treat the toilet itself like a controlled station. The container needs to be stable, and it needs a liner system you can trust. One bag can work, but many households find a double liner approach reduces the chance of catastrophic failure when the bag is moved. You don't overfill, you don't make it work one more time, because overfilling is how you create spills, and spills are how you turn a manageable problem into a stressful cleanup. Next comes the part that decides whether your home stays sane: sealing and separation. The Cold War logic pushed people to seal waste bags tightly and keep them apart from other rubbish. And that principle is still correct because food waste attracts pests and odors, and human waste is a different category entirely. When those two mix, the smell and the hazard multiply, and you're forced to handle the mess more often, which increases risk. So you separate. You keep one dedicated container for sealed toilet bags, ideally with a lid, ideally kept outside the main living area if possible, and you keep ordinary household rubbish separate. Then you build the hygiene steps into the act itself, so you don't rely on willpower. This is the uncomfortable truth of emergencies. Nobody maintains perfect standards when they're tired, cold, or frightened, so the plan must be designed for imperfect humans. That's why the hand cleaning step needs to be immediate and unavoidable. If water is still available, you prioritize soap and proper hand washing. If water is limited, you use alcohol-based sanitizer as a backup, but you still aim for real washing when you can. The goal is not to be obsessive. It's to break the chain of transmission. And that chain is not theoretical. It's the simplest route from mild inconvenience to everyone in the house feels ill. Now, there's another modern mistake that makes emergency toilets fail even when people have the right supplies. They treat odor as the main problem and go hunting for chemical solutions without understanding what they're mixing or why. In a calm world, people assume stronger chemicals mean safer outcomes. In a disrupted world, guessing with chemicals is how you create new hazards inside the home. The smarter approach, the Cold War approach, is to prioritize physical containment, cleanliness, ventilation, and simple, known cleaning products used as directed, rather than making a chemistry experiment out of panic. It's also why the most important part isn't the bucket. Line is true. The bucket is only a container. The plan is the discipline. And discipline is built by reducing choices. You write a short routine that anyone in the household can follow. Prepare the station, use it, seal the bag properly, move it to the dedicated waste container, clean hands, wipe any surfaces that were touched, and reset the station for the next person. You keep the instructions visible, not because people are unintelligent, but because under stress, even intelligent people forget steps. In other words, you turn the emergency toilet into a process that protects dignity and health, rather than an object that sits there reminding everyone that life has become unpleasant. Now, if this all sounds too serious for something as ordinary as a toilet, that's precisely why Cold War households took it seriously. Ordinary problems become defining problems when the systems that carry them away stop working. But we still haven't dealt with the question everyone actually cares about. What does the best modern setup look like in a normal home, with normal people, including older family members, without turning the bathroom into a hazardous corner or making the whole house feel like a campsite? Because there's a way to build a clean, stable, discreet emergency toilet system in about 15 minutes. And the details of comfort and stability are the difference between a plan you can actually live with and a plan you abandon after day one. So let's turn this into a modern, calm, genuinely usable blueprint. Not a survivalist project, just a sensible household system that protects hygiene and dignity if plumbing becomes unreliable for a day, a week, or longer. Start by thinking in two versions, because most people overbuild for the apocalypse and underbuild for reality. The minimal setup and the robust setup. The minimal setup is for short disruptions, when you still have some water or you expect services to return. It focuses on a stable emergency toilet station, basic containment, and strict hand hygiene. The robust setup is for longer disruption, when water pressure is low, when there are boil water notices, or when you're trying to reduce how often you have to handle waste. It adds more liners, a clearer waste separation routine, and a comfort-first layout that makes the station acceptable for older family members. Step 1 is location, and this is where most plans fail quietly. Don't put the station where you eat. Don't put it where you sleep if you can avoid it. Choose a space that can be ventilated, that has a solid floor, and that can be kept private without turning the house into a maze. Privacy is not a luxury here. It's what stops a household's mood from collapsing. Then build the toilet itself as a stable, repeatable unit. You want a rigid container with a lid, and you want a liner system you trust. A single heavy-duty liner can work, but a double liner reduces failure when you're tired and moving quickly, and fatigue is the real enemy of good hygiene. If you're using absorbent material, treat it as a helper, not as magic. The real safety comes from sealing and separation. For comfort, especially with older people, the station needs stability. A wobbly setup turns a hygiene plan into a fall risk, and a fall risk is a far bigger emergency than an unpleasant toilet. If you can add a stable seat arrangement, you do it. You also stage the station so the routine is obvious. Liners, wipes or paper, gloves if you use them, a small lidded container for cleaning cloths, and a hand cleaning point within arm's reach, so nobody has to walk through the house touching doors and handles before cleaning their hands. Now, the core of the blueprint is a routine so simple it feels almost insulting, and that's exactly why it works under stress. You want 5 actions that happen the same way every time. Line, use, seal, store, clean. Line the container properly, and check the liner isn't slipping. Use the station without rushing. Seal the liner immediately and properly, with enough air pushed out that it doesn't balloon and leak. Store that sealed bag in a dedicated lidded container that is not mixed with food waste, ideally placed outside the main living area or at least away from living and eating spaces. And then clean. Hands first, always, and then any surfaces that were touched. That order matters because hands are the fastest way contamination moves around a house. If water is available, soap and proper hand washing is your gold standard. If water is limited, sanitizer becomes a bridge, but you still aim to wash properly when you can, because feeling clean and being clean are not the same thing. The next part is what makes the plan livable. Odor control without dangerous improvisation. People panic about smell, and smell makes people do silly things with chemicals. The smart approach is boring. Keep everything sealed properly, keep the waste container lidded, ventilate the station area if possible, and avoid mixing cleaning products in a way you don't fully understand. Containment does most of the odor control for you when it's done properly. And then you do something that feels almost too organized for an emergency. You make a tiny instruction card, in plain English, stuck near the station. Not because your family is incapable, but because stress makes everyone forget steps, and a forgotten step in sanitation becomes a mess that you then have to handle repeatedly. Your card is short. Seal bag every time. Waste in a lidded bin. Wash hands immediately. Why contact points? Reset station. That's it. Now add the Cold War finishing touch. Reduce decision-making. You decide in advance what good enough looks like. You decide how often the waste container is checked. You decide who is responsible for resetting the station if there are multiple people in the house. You decide what you do if a bag leaks. Not with drama, just with a simple plan. Isolate, clean with a known product, wash hands, ventilate, move on. This is the part that makes the system psychologically powerful. It stops the bathroom from becoming a daily argument and turns it into a routine. Finally, think about accessibility. If your household includes older relatives, you plan for them specifically. A stable seat, a clear path with no trip hazards, a safe light source for night use, and a location that doesn't force them up and down stairs unnecessarily. If your household includes children, you simplify further. You keep the instruction card visible, you keep cleaning supplies out of reach but available, and you keep the routine consistent so it becomes normal rather than frightening. Because the end goal is not to survive like a camper. It's to keep your home feeling like a home, even when services are unreliable. And that's the punchline of the whole video. The Cold War emergency toilet was never about being extreme. It was about being realistic. It was a recognition that if you protect sanitation, you protect health, calm, and dignity. And those 3 things keep families functioning when everything else feels uncertain. So if you take one thing away from this, let it be this. Don't wait for the day you can't flush to start inventing a hygiene system on the fly. Build the boring plan now, while you're calm, and you'll never have to turn a simple disruption into a slow-moving crisis inside your own home.